All right, today we're digging into a brand new report from Sophos all about the state of ransomware in education. This isn't just theory, it's based on what over 400 IT leaders who've been hit by these attacks have actually gone through in the last year. And let me tell you, their stories show a battlefield that is changing and fast. So that really gets to the heart of what we're exploring today. In this world of constantly evolving threats, how are schools and universities actually fighting back? The answer, as you'll see, is pretty complex. There are some surprising wins and some trends that are frankly deeply concerning. To really wrap our heads around this, we're going to follow the entire life cycle of a ransomware attack. We'll start with how they get in, then see what happens to the data once they're inside. From there, we'll dive into the crazy high-stakes world of ransom negotiations, tally up the real costs after the fact, and finally, look at the hidden human price of it all. Okay, let's jump right into stage one, the breach. Before any data can be held hostage, the attackers have got to find a way in the door. And what's fascinating here is that the way in looks very different for K-12 schools compared to big universities. So for K-12 schools, what's wild is that there's no single dominant weak spot. Yeah, phishing is technically number one, but look how tight that is. Compromised credentials, malicious emails, they're all right there. It tells you attackers aren't just picking one lock, they're rattling every door handle they can find. But then you look at higher education, and it's a completely different story. It is not scattered at all. For the third year in a row, exploited vulnerabilities are the number one way in, and by a pretty wide margin. This just screams to the huge challenge universities have trying to patch every hole in their massive, complex networks. And this gets to a really critical point. It's not just about the technical how, it's about the organizational why. For K-12, the biggest issue is a straight-up lack of people and expertise. It's a resource problem. For universities, it's those unknown security gaps, the weaknesses they didn't even know they had, which, is a classic problem when your network is just incredibly sprawling and complex. Okay, so the attackers are in. Now what? Well, their goal is simple. Take the data hostage. This brings us to stage 2 of the attack, and honestly, some of the most surprising findings in this entire report. And believe it or not, this is where we see a huge win for the good guys. Data encryption rates are at a 4-year low across the board. But look at K-12. This is amazing. An incredible 67% of attacks were stopped before the data was even encrypted. That is the best prevention rate of any sector Sophos surveyed. It shows they are getting seriously good at spotting trouble early. But, and this is a big but, what happens when attackers do manage to encrypt the data? This is where things get a bit concerning. We're seeing fewer schools using their backups to restore data, especially in higher ed. At the same time, about half of them are still paying the ransom. That gap between using backups and just paying the criminals is getting narrower, and that points to a pretty risky reliance on paying your way out of trouble. And of course, that reliance on paying leads us straight into the messiest part of this whole crisis, the negotiation. This is where the money changes hands, and let me tell you, the numbers have taken an absolutely dramatic turn this year. So just to set the stage, let's rewind to last year. The median ransom payment made by a K-12 school was a staggering $6.6 million. Can you even imagine? That is an absolutely crippling amount of money for a public school system. Okay, now look at this year. That number has completely plummeted, an 88% drop, down to $800,000. It's not just a dip, it's a seismic shift. Higher education saw a similar freefall, going from over $4.4 million down to about $463,000. The attackers are clearly changing their whole financial game plan. So the big question is, why are payments so much lower? Well, part of the answer is in the negotiation itself, and it looks like higher ed is getting particularly good at this. A full 60% of universities paid less than what was first demanded, ending up paying, on average, just 69% of the initial ask. They are really starting to push back effectively. But here's where it gets really interesting. The reasons they paid less are totally different. For universities, it was mostly because they successfully negotiated. They haggled the price down. But for K-12 schools, the number one reason was that the attackers themselves lowered the demand. That suggests they were trying to encourage a faster, easier payday. It just points to a completely different power dynamic at that negotiating table. You might think paying the ransom is the end of the nightmare. It's not. Not even close. The cleanup and recovery that comes next has its own jaw-dropping price tag. So let's move on to the aftermath and look at the real and often hidden costs. And this right here is a shocking paradox. Even though K-12 schools are paying way less in ransoms, they're getting hit with the single highest recovery cost of any sector, a whopping $2.28 million. At the same time, higher ed has the lowest. Now, this is probably because K-12 schools have more limited IT teams and older tech, which just makes the whole cleanup process way more expensive and complicated.
But it is not all bad news here. There is a definite silver lining in the aftermath. Both sectors are getting way more resilient. Over half of all educational institutions are now back on their feet, fully recovered, within just 1 week. That is a massive improvement over last year, and it shows they're getting much better at putting their incident response plans into action.
So, we've talked a lot about data, and we've talked a lot about dollars. But every single one of these attacks has a huge impact on the people who are on the front lines, the IT and the cybersecurity teams. And this is the human toll that often gets overlooked. First, you have to understand the psychological weight of this. It's immense. After an attack, 41% of the people on these teams report a lasting increase in anxiety and stress about what could happen next. They are basically living with this constant threat hanging over their heads. And that stress, it directly leads to burnout. You've got almost 40% of people facing a permanently bigger workload as they try to shore up defenses, and nearly a third of teams saw people having to take time off work specifically because of the stress from the attack. And finally, there's the professional fallout, which can be absolutely brutal. Think about this. In 1 out of every 4 successful attacks in education, the head of the IT department was replaced. The stakes aren't just about the school's data. They are deeply personal and can define a person's entire career. So, after seeing all of this, what's the path forward? Well, the report boils it down to 4 really critical recommendations. First, focus on prevention to get rid of those root causes we saw at the beginning. Second, protect your endpoints with solid anti-ransomware tech. Third, you need 24/7 detection and response because these attacks don't stick to business hours. And finally, plan and prepare. Have an incident response plan and actually practice it so you know what to do when things go bad.
Which leaves us with one final thought to chew on. We've seen the financial hit, the operational chaos, and the heavy human cost. When you add all of that up, it really makes you ask the question, knowing the full, devastating cost of an attack, is stopping it before it even starts the only real way to win this war?